He was an ancient philosopher whose life is shrouded in mystery. We know almost nothing about who he was, but he wrote what is believed to be the earliest critique of Jesus and Christians. This is Bible Search and Rescue. Welcome back to the Westar Institute's Bible Search and Rescue project. My name is Chad Venters. I am the Director of Bible Search and Rescue and a scholar for Westar. Here at Bible Search and Rescue, our goal is to make scholarship accessible to the general public. These video introductions are designed to be just that, introductions to topics that will hopefully help you, the audience, explore topics of importance with greater depth. In our current video series, we are examining authors outside of the New Testament to gain a better understanding of Jesus as a historical figure. In our previous videos, we examined the writings of Josephus and Tacitus to determine what they offered about an understanding of Jesus as a historical figure. Neither of those authors had a lot of detail to provide us, but today we're going to examine the writings of a philosopher who provides a great deal of information about Jesus, even though we know next to nothing about the author himself. Today we are going to examine the writings of Celsus. Part of the challenge is Celsus's writings did not survive on their own. It was perhaps sometime in the middle of the 2nd century CE that Celsus wrote the first known critique of Jesus and his followers, called Aletheis Logos, or True Word. The book didn't survive, but we know about it because a 3rd century Christian thinker named Origen wrote a rebuttal to Celsus in a book called Against Celsus. Origen's response may have been 100 years after Celsus's original work, though we don't know for sure. Origen quotes Celsus extensively in his rebuttal. And while it is possible that Origen could at times misquote or misrepresent what Celsus was saying, there's a good chance that we have a solid basis for knowing what Celsus's arguments were. He had a lot to say about Jesus, and frankly, none of it was very good. Celsus provides us an alternative perspective to Jesus that was not fueled by the belief that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God, or miracle worker. As we'll see, when Celsus looked at the life of Jesus, he thought that much of what was written was clearly made up, and that, well, frankly, Jesus was a fraud. Origen's response to Celsus is rather lengthy, so we're going to look at some of the highlights to give you a sense of some of his criticisms, which gives us a window into how a Roman thinker like Celsus viewed the story of Jesus during his time. In our video on Tacitus, we discussed the Roman perspective on Christians, specifically that they were not viewed as practitioners of religion. They were deemed to be a superstition. The modern English equivalent of superstition would be the word cult. It is commonly accepted that Celsus was a Platonist philosopher, and he was a dyed-in-the-wool Roman. Groups advancing new cult ideas were not well received at this time. It's actually much like today, when new religions are commonly deemed to be cults, or even evil, as they reject traditional beliefs. In the United States, Christianity is often deemed the traditional religious belief. But in the early centuries following Jesus' death, followers of Jesus were considered to be part of a cult that rejected the good, moral, religious tradition of Rome. This was problematic for Celsus, who became the first known person to actually pen such a criticism against Christians. As we read through some of Celsus's work, one gets the impression that Celsus viewed Jesus and Christians through a satirical lens. He doesn't really understand how anybody could take these beliefs seriously or find them appealing. He would have considered it laughable if someone had told him Christianity would become the religion of the empire. With this background, let's jump in and look at Celsus's writings. We'll be following the translation from Henry Chadwick, unless otherwise noted. Celsus's first main point in his desire to attack Christianity is that Christians secretly make associations with one another, contrary to the laws, because societies which are public are allowed by the laws, but secret societies are illegal. And wishing to slander the so-called love which Christians have for one another, he says that it exists because of the common danger and is more powerful than any oath. So, at the bar of truth, the laws of the nations, such as those about images and the godless polytheism, are laws of the Scythians, or, if possible, more impious than theirs. Therefore, it is not wrong to form associations against the laws for the sake of truth. For just as it would be right for people to form associations secretly to kill a tyrant who had seized control of their city, so too, since the devil, as Christians call him, and falsehood reign as tyrants, Christians form associations against the devil contrary to his laws, in order to save others whom they might be able to persuade to abandon the law, which is like that of the Scythians and of a tyrant. Celsus begins his criticism by noting that Christians are a secret society, which is illegal, and in his mind, it's inherently sketchy. What's interesting is that Origen does not dispute the fact that Christians are meeting in secret, but he argues they are justified in doing so because the laws are unjust. Origen believes killing a tyrant is just and compares these actions to combating the devil himself. Had Celsus still been alive when Origen wrote this response, I doubt he would have found this an adequate rebuttal. If anything, it probably would have confirmed his belief that Christians were lawbreakers and a threat to Rome. These next issues are connected and reflect an interesting ancient debate about approved and unapproved behavior. However, he next attacks the Savior also, saying that it was by magic that he was able to do the miracles which he appeared to have done. And because he foresaw that others too would get to know the same formulas and do the same thing, and boast that they did so by God's power, Jesus expelled them from his society. Let us see how Celsus, who professes to know everything, misrepresents the Jews when he says that they worship angels and are addicted to sorcery, of which Moses was their teacher. As he professes to know the books of Christians and Jews, let him declare where in Moses' writings he found the lawgiver enjoining them to worship angels. How also can there be sorcery among people who accept the law of Moses if they have read the commandment, "Ye shall not cleave to enchanters to be polluted by them"? This line of thought is interesting, as it reflects ancient debate regarding the difference between magic and miracle. The ancient world was full of people who practiced different kinds of rites and rituals that we would call magic. Some people shy away from the use of the word magic because they see it as having a negative connotation, and will choose instead to use the word miracle to describe that process. But if you have two different people performing different rites and rituals in the name of different gods, and both are successfully achieving what they said they would do, how do you tell the difference between magic and miracle? The answer is, it just depends on your perspective of the individual performing the rites. We have hundreds of spells from the ancient world designed to achieve different things, from healing to making someone fall in love with you. These spells invoke different deities, which means that someone might be skeptical that a true miracle was performed if it was done in the name of a deity that they don't believe in or they don't agree with. Celsus does not deny that Jesus appeared to do things that his followers consider to be miracles. But instead of miracles, Celsus thinks that Jesus was a practitioner of magic. Celsus is aware of Jesus' Jewish background, and in looking at the history of Judaism, these stories of Moses really looked to someone like Celsus as being magic, and that Moses was a sorcerer practicing some type of magic in the name of a specific Hebrew deity. For many Romans who thought Judaism was already a strange faith, the stories about Moses, Elijah, Elisha, among others, really look like Jewish people practiced a lot of magic. It's also easy for a modern audience to find it confusing that someone like Celsus might think that the Jews worshipped angels. But for someone who believed in various deities, and that some deities were more powerful than others in the cosmology that they existed in, Jewish writing at the time of Celsus kind of looked like a form of cosmic dualism, in which various entities of varying degrees of power were engaged in constant combat. Whether you call those deities gods, angels, or demons, it all still kind of looked like competing deities fighting, even if you choose different names for them. In fact, the Greek word daimon, which is translated in the New Testament as demon, was used by Greek writers to describe various deities who could be good or bad. As we'll see, Celsus was not the only one who looked at the story of Jesus and thought he was a magician and not a miracle worker. First, because he, Jesus, fabricated the story of his birth from a virgin, and he reproaches him because he came from a Jewish village and from a poor country woman who earned her living by spinning. He says that she was driven out by her husband, who was a carpenter by trade, and she was convicted of adultery. Then he says that after she had been driven out by her husband, and while she was wandering about in a disgraceful way, she secretly gave birth to Jesus. And he says that because he was poor, he hired himself out as a workman in Egypt, and there tried his hand at certain magical powers on which the Egyptians pride themselves. He returned full of conceit because of these powers, and on account of them, gave himself the title of God. So here is where the story gets really fascinating that Celsus is telling. And as you might imagine, Origen is quite offended by it. The tradition Celsus knew was that Jesus' mother, who was said to be a poor woman, was actually convicted of adultery and driven away by her husband. As we might expect someone like Celsus, or essentially anybody who doesn't believe that Jesus is a supernatural being, is very skeptical of the notion that Jesus was born of a virgin. Instead, wherever he got his information from, those sources indicated to him that Jesus was born of adultery, his mom was driven out of her home, and that Jesus, as a poor young man, ends up lending himself out in Egypt, a place where the practitioners of magic were well known. During Jesus' time in Egypt is where he ends up picking up these various practices that he then uses to deceive people into thinking he is some kind of a holy man. Wherever this tradition came from, it seems to be connected with the birth narrative in Matthew, which is the only book of the New Testament that says anything about Jesus having to go down into Egypt. Now, of course, for Christians, all of this seems, well, rather strange and bizarre, right? It seems like nonsense But for people who aren't Christians, the idea of Jesus being born of a virgin through divine impregnation also seems like nonsense. So once again, this comes down to perspective. And from a historical point of view, one examines all of this and sees that there are very obvious competing traditions about where Jesus came from and whether or not he was truly some form of a miracle worker. Celsus builds on this tradition by looking at what he believes was a scandal surrounding Jesus' birth. As part of this imaginary dialogue, Celsus introduces a Jewish character into the story who then criticizes Jesus. Let us return, however, to the words put into the mouth of the Jew, where the mother of Jesus is described as having been turned out by the carpenter, who was betrothed to her, as she had been convicted of adultery, and had a child by a certain soldier named Pantera. Let us consider whether those who fabricated the myth that the virgin and Pantera committed adultery and that the carpenter turned her out were not blind when they concocted all this to get rid of the miraculous conception by the Holy Spirit. Now, this is really interesting. Not only is the adultery of Jesus' mother referred to, but Celsus even has a name of the person he claims is the real father of Jesus, Pantera. There's a couple of things that make this really fascinating. First, Celsus is not the only ancient author who claimed that Jesus' real father was a man named Pantera. When we look at the Talmud, we see a tradition about someone called Benada, who some believe is a reference to Jesus. It is taught that Rabbi Eleazar said to the wise, "Did not Benada bring spells from Egypt in a cut in his flesh? They said to him he was a fool, and they do not bring evidence from a fool." Benada is Ben Pantera. Rabbi Hista said, "The husband was Stada, the lover was Pantera. The mother was Miriam, the dresser of women's hair. As we say in Pumbedita, she has been false to her husband." Notice how similar this is to Celsus, but it's coming from a rabbinic tradition, not a Greek one. Spells in the flesh is another way of saying Jesus practiced magic. So in this rabbinic tradition, if one concludes it's talking about Jesus, then we see he learned magic in Egypt, as Celsus claimed, and his mother Mary had a lover named Pantera, which is one letter different from Panthera. However, even if one is skeptical that Benada is Jesus, we know for sure that in the Jewish text Toledot Yeshu, Jewish tradition held that Jesus' real father was a soldier named Pantera. And in that text, his name was Joseph Pantera. In other words, the belief that Jesus' real father was a man named Panthera or Pantera was not isolated. In fact, it was well known as a tradition among Orthodox Christianity and was addressed by various Orthodox fathers, such as Eusebius and Epiphanius. But they did it in different ways. But where did that name come from? Well, one common belief that came into scholarship was that Panthera was actually not a name. It was a mocking play on words, making fun of Jesus' alleged virgin birth. The Greek word Parthenos was used by Matthew and Luke in their distinct narratives to describe Mary as a virgin. This led some scholars to conclude that Panthera wasn't actually a name, it was just a variation of the word Parthenos, as an anti-Christian smear. The problem is, those two words aren't really that similar, but many accepted this as a viable explanation. Then, in 1920, a scholar named Adolf Deismann published an article about a discovered sculpture of a soldier in Germany that had an epitaph written on it. The soldier's name was Tiberius Julius Abdus Pantera. It turns out that based on his naming convention, this soldier would have been born sometime between 31 and 10 BCE, before Jesus was born, and retired under Emperor Tiberius, who was emperor when Jesus was executed. It is also widely believed that Panthera's cohort was in the area of Judea and Galilee at the time Jesus would have been conceived. Based on when Panthera was born, and when one believes Jesus was born, he would be the right age to have fathered a child during that period. Would this be the actual father of Jesus? Well, that's a little trickier. Recent research has suggested that Panthera's unit was in fact in Germania, not Galilee. Now, does that mean he couldn't have fathered Jesus? No. It means he would have needed to have fathered Jesus prior to becoming a soldier. However, the bigger issue is that there is nothing that directly connects Tiberius Julius Aptus Pantera to Jesus historically. Other than a tradition that says Jesus' biological father was a soldier named Pantera, there's nothing that ties this particular soldier named Pantera to Jesus. Without question, the discovery is interesting, as the name and occupation align, and even the time frame may work, but without something that connects that particular Pantera to Jesus, we have no way of making a sound historical connection between Jesus and that soldier. Just as historically the notion of Jesus being born of a literal biological version is deeply problematic and seems like later myth building, especially when considering there are two completely different narratives in the New Testament, there's simply no way of knowing if Pantera is the soldier that Celsus knew of as Panthera. In this short look at Celsus's view of Jesus, there are some things that stand out. Whereas writings that would be part of the New Testament present Jesus in a completely heroic and/or divine terms, Celsus's understanding of Jesus was that he was a charlatan, a fraud, someone who had a shady past. To put into modern terminology, he conned people into thinking he had some kind of power. It's clear that believers won't buy into this, though the potential historical traditions are interesting for looking at Jesus as a historical figure. However, something that is important to take from Celsus's work is that he never treats Jesus as being anything other than a historical figure. Celsus has no impression that Jesus was a myth or some made-up folk tale. He absolutely seems to believe that Jesus was a real person, and a terrible one at that, who cheated people, deceived them, and ended up getting his just desserts when he was executed. Perhaps what Celsus helps us best understand about the historical Jesus is how the non-Christian Roman world, which was the overwhelming majority of the Roman world in Celsus's day, viewed Jesus. At least those who paid any attention to anything about Jesus or his strange cult. Thank you for joining us on Bible Search and Rescue. On behalf of the Westar Institute, my name is Chad Vinners, and we look forward to connecting with you in our next episode. And until then, we encourage you to see how scholarship can impact your life and to go out and to make a positive difference in somebody else's life. Take care, everybody, and thank you.